Welcome, everyone. Um, Thank you for attending the next webinar in Maryland Online's Professional Development Series. We are asking everyone to please stay muted throughout and put your questions in the chat. We will address the questions close to the end of the presentation. The recording will be made later today, should be made available later today or by tomorrow. Today, we have a special guest speaker, Crystal Lynese-Walker. With over 15 years of experience, Crystal Lynese has helped organizations develop workflow processes and curate equitable and inclusive workplaces through result-driven methods. As the founder of Crystal Clear Consulting, she uses cultural intelligence as a catalyst for change and disruption within the diversity, equity, and inclusion sector. Crystal Lynese is the Associate Director of Black Equity at Work for Management Leadership for Tomorrow, where she spearheads business operations and leads the employer success team to drive Black equity across corporations in the U.S. Crystal balances work by exploring life as a Black elder millennial woman who enjoys comic books, music, small business shopping, plants, and learning about rest as a form of resistance. And I will now turn it over to Crystal Lynese.
Well, hello and good morning to everyone. I thank you for inviting me here today to speak. I had the pleasure of speaking at one of these events last year, and it was so engaging and it was such a timely discussion that when Wendy offered the opportunity to come back and speak, I absolutely had to say yes. I've had some changes myself since our last meeting or last event. As Wendy expressed in my bio, I'm the Associate Director of Black Equity at Work, which is a new first national certification program that really focuses on Black equity in the workplace. But prior to that, I was an associate professor of communication, and I understand how important this is within our institutions. When we start thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, we often think that this is all heartfelt work. And heartfelt work is a great way to think about it. But oftentimes we need to move beyond just how we feel and actually set some really measurable goals within our institutions to hold us accountable for those activities and what we think we're doing to really impact change. Since the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020, this country has really been grappling with what were once silenced or ignored voices now having a loudspeaker that has reverberated around the world. And in the midst of a global pandemic, our country erupted in protests, calls for action and resistance. And this wasn't just nationally, this was impactful to our own communities. Our students were getting involved, our faculty and staff were getting involved, and this idea of employee activism was on the rise. Some of us have sat numb and others felt empowered by the events of 2020, but so many people also wept from exhaustion, and the majority of others just really didn't have any clue on what to do. All of this has really culminated in a year of increased focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as belonging, as Wendy and I spoke about earlier. You know, CEOs and higher education leadership made declarations of commitment to not just anti-racist work, but to overhauling and thinking about their DEIB strategies. We saw this through presidents releasing statements. Black boxes were all over social media. There were countless colleges and institutions that had Black boxes to show solidarity. There were debates over which lives mattered that happened all over Twitter. Even there's a whole sector, if you're on Twitter, there's an entire sector for higher education professionals, and they were really involved in this work and these discussions. Maryland Online's commitment to continue these conversations is vital to impacting our industry and to us as individuals. All of this for me was, the signal for a shift. This industry, this idea of higher education and higher learning is really starting to look to take a moment to reimagine and rebuild, both of which require slowing down and examining the reality of what we already have, what exists within our institutions, within the framework of our institutions. Today, I'm going to talk about how do we disrupt the biases that we have to actually get to the point of developing metrics within DEIB frameworks. So I look at this into three sections. First, understanding the role of learning and understanding how bias and unconscious bias impacts us. Now, this session isn't really focused on unconscious bias, so I won't spend a whole lot of time, but what you're gonna start to see is how our levels of bias impact the way that we develop DEI plans and strategies for our institutions, and also thinking about how bold and forward we want to be with the metrics we create. We're then going to talk about how do we explore the institutional, individual, and community impact of the biases and the structures that we set. And my favorite part, the last part, is how do we disrupt that? And when we talk about this, I'm going to talk about three key areas that your DEI plans for your institutions need to have, but not just a huge plan that your institution needs to have, but thinking about metrics that you can set as an individual, right, that can impact and make real change in this particular space within higher education. I always want you to feel free to ask questions. And there are going to be a few times when I like engagement. So I'll say, put your thoughts in the chat. Toward the end, we'll have an open Q&A, and Wendy will be able to share your questions so that we can talk even more candidly and more specifically to your questions and what you're curious about and doing in this space. So to get us started, there are quite a few of you here. I think we're up to almost 30 of you here. And so what I would like is, I'll give you a few moments in the chat. Please share why the topic of developing metrics is important to you, or why you're curious about it, and why do you think this may be important for your institution on this journey? So I will give us a few moments to share that in the chat. And Wendy, if you could please just share some of the responses, that would be great.
Absolutely. We have a quiet group.
We do. And so I will, as a previous professor, we all know how it feels to ask a question and have our students, right, stare back at us. So I am going to give us another moment. I'll restate the question. Please share why. Oh, I'm seeing, you got some things?
We do have some. Okay, so informs us of what is working and not working. Without metrics, we seem to be turning in, I should say that was from Sandra Lee, and from Sarah Felber. Without metrics, we seem to be turning in circles, saying that DEIB is important, but not making real change. Suzanne Wright writes, our institution is getting ready to embark on a DEI self-study. And another from Sandra Lee, give us a focus. Melissa Harris wrote, metrics and data are what can drive institutional change. Brandy Whitlock wrote, I'm interested in how we can better measure DEIB at the classroom level. Deanne Thorne, hold leadership accountable for DEIB measures. Michelle Kloss, my institution is in the process of trying to identify, develop metrics specific to DEIB, student learning, and student outcomes. I thought this session might provide some guidance and ideas. Julie wrote, can you repeat the question? Julie Prosky Hamlin from Maryland Online. And I withdraw my comment of this being a quiet group.
Well, good. Everyone needed to wake up a bit. I don't know about you, but I'm still waiting for my coffee to kick in. So maybe coffee has started to kick in and we're getting comfortable. All of these, why you're sharing these are, I'm excited that this is why you're here. We often look for examples, but we also look for answers. And if you're in higher education, we tend to naturally be curious people. We want to know more, we want to understand more. And so bringing all of this together is really key for us to move that forward. So I'm going to say some things that we're going to get straight to the point here. And one of the points that we're going to discuss is this bias in higher education. And let's sit with this reality for a moment. Higher education institutions in this country was founded on white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormative, and elitism frameworks. I'm going to say that again because I think we need to sit in the space as to how our institutions were even formed. It was founded on white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormative, and elitism frameworks. If we think about the founding of American higher education institutions, and we think about who had access to learning at a higher education institution, but also who worked, who leads, right? Who funds, the projects that we have and what we're leading. All of that is wrapped into the biases that existed in the beginning. It's easy for us to think, well, that's not what education or higher education is founded on now. And I do believe that that's not necessarily where we think of higher education. But we have to grapple and sit with the fact that some of our very industry norms have derived from biases, and that we have all in some way at some point helped continue to perpetuate those biases within higher education. And as someone talked about in sharing in the chat, what are some ways that we can disrupt this and hold ourselves accountable? And one of those ways is having clear metrics for ourselves and having these metrics in a way that we hold ourselves accountable. If we think about ourselves as educators, we develop rubrics, right, to grade and score assignments that our students are doing. And we have specific metrics that students have to meet. And yet we tend to shy away from developing some hard-hitting metrics to grade ourselves on our own progress when it comes to forcing, and I'm not going to use the word force, but in order to enforce and reinforce better practices and better outcomes when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So how does unconscious bias play into all of this? When we think about unconscious bias, we know that it's the underlying attitudes and stereotypes that we hold ourselves accountable for. And unfortunately, we attribute other people and other groups of people with those particular attitudes. And what we then begin to do is we shift our behavior, right, in order to respond to the biases that we have. Now, all of us have biases, okay? All of us. What the key here is, what do we do when we realize we have them, and how are we using them to be harmful to others? There are some advantages to thinking about the structure and the theory and concept of unconscious bias. It brings unconscious biases to the surface, right? If we keep talking about what's unconscious, it leaves that unconscious box and moves into a conscious state. It also helps promote understanding of where our biases come from, right? Like I just said before, when it comes to higher education, there are biases that were built into the framework of establishing this institution. And so where do they come from and how do they impact us? And it also provides us a guidance on how to counter them, right, with our behaviors. If we know exactly what our biases are doing, we could then say, okay, when this comes up, when my biases kick in, what do I do to disrupt that? But there are also some shortcomings to thinking about unconscious bias. Oftentimes it can promote a lack of individual accountability. We can say, well, I'm not X, but my institution is Y. Or we can even say things like, I am not doing racist things in my classroom, or I'm finding ways to be more supportive of my LGBTQ students. The other thing that it also does is that it promotes a lack of accountability on an individual scale beyond our students. And that's something we're going to focus on, but also it impacts the way that we work and interact with our colleagues. And last, shortcoming of unconscious bias is that it focuses on consciousness and changing your heart. And at some point, we have to accept that there will be individuals and institutions that want to maintain, because maintaining those biases and maintaining those elitism, patriarchy, heteronormative biases and frameworks are profitable. And when I mean profitable, it doesn't always mean that that's in money, but there's value in things staying the way that they used to be. And it can be harder to move the needle. I know someone shared, having clear metrics can really help hold leadership accountable. You're absolutely correct, it can. But we have to think about, how do we even shift the conversation and move beyond the conversation? At some point, we have to actually get to the work. And we need to think about the fact that there are going to be those within our institutions, within our departments, right, within different divisions that don't want to change their heart. And we have to be okay with that. And that is why having clear metrics helps ensure that even if your heart doesn't change, I have clear metrics in place for this institution to ensure that your behavior does. So let's take a moment to explore, okay? When we think about exploring, right, what I want to know, again in the chat, is what are some impacts, whether it's the industry or the institution, that you feel impacts our ability to even create metrics? Why do you think that our institutions can struggle with creating or developing clear metrics when it comes to DEIB related work? And I'll drop that question in the chat as well. And so again, the question is, what are some of the impacts that we face due to the existing biases and lack of metrics within our industry?
Okay. All right, so we have, like you said, not wanting to let go of the status quo, lack of clear direction, lack of accountability, lack of buy-in, minimal actions, constant churn of administrators, initiatives, etc. People then think this work is just soft skills. There is no measuring or institutionalization. And then we have a yes on accountability.
Yes, on accountability. And the comment about people thinking that this work is just soft skills, you're absolutely right. It's often why I refer to, most people think this is hard work. In our hearts and our minds, we should want to be better people. We should want our institutions to be better. And that is very true. But hard work has not really moved the needle much in higher education over the last 400 years. And we need to rethink about, at what point does hard work no longer work? Thank you all for those who shared in the chat. Yes, repetitive process, tiring people out. Absolutely, Sandra. By the way, hi, Sandra. I was a professor at Howard Community College and got a chance to work with Sandra quite a bit. So it's great to see her here in the chat. So when we think about exploring the impact and the biases that exist, I like to call it a cycle of macro and micro biases. When we think about this is systemic or industry-specific biases provide a framework for institutional bias. And then what do we do as individuals? We reinforce those biases, and then we have a direct impact on the community and the very people that we're here to serve, right? So it's always this cycle, institutional systemic barriers and systemic biases that exist. And when we get into this funnel, we begin to say, you know, well, that's just how things happen in higher education, or this is an acceptable form of work or ideology in our industry. And well, you know, we are grappling with what's happening in K through 12, and we're just higher education, and we have to deal with it on the back end. We have all of these excuses and reasons to continue to let this cycle go and go and go, which is what leads us to some of your very concerns. Lack of accountability, not understanding how to build metrics for this particular space. Also not knowing what to focus on, but also having a very linear focus. We'll talk more, but often in higher education, we focus on our students, which we should be focusing on the climate for our students. But how often are we setting metrics to talk about our colleagues, the makeup of our institutions? Who's running our institutions is just important as who we have bringing into our institutions, right, to educate. And all of this has a major impact and a major shift on the institution, on individuals within these institutions, and then the community at large. If we think about those frameworks that I talked about that higher education was built on, we have to think about the fact that bias impacts our beliefs and values, as well as our actions. Right? From an institutional perspective, we constantly deal with elitism and belonging. People who are visiting our colleges, people who are our colleagues, students who are attending our institution. We've come to this idea, right? Because again, thinking about those white supremacy heteronormative frameworks, we decide who we think should belong in an institution. From an individual perspective, we start internalizing those systemic biases as norms for the industry rather than seeing it as an oppressive system. And then we often rely on the institution for guidance to breaking down the barriers that we see, rather than having some personal autonomy to think about, how do I make disruption in this space? And last, we know that it impacts our community at large, right? It's a continued legacy of mistrust in the classroom from students. There's a continued legacy of ideas of perpetuating stereotypes in the classroom, as well as the services that we can offer. We often, find ways. Higher education has this major way to impact so many different industries, and yet we still continue to rest in a space that allows us to impact our community in a way that doesn't move us forward. And then it also develops false and biased ideologies about who is worthy. And it goes right back to perpetuating this cycle, right, of macro and micro biases. And this leads to a lack of accountability, which often is correlated with a lack of clear metrics for what we're trying to put in place. The impact of macro and micro bias and tearing that down is essential to actually moving forward, right? You can't really develop metrics and key activities for your DEI strategies or to hold your leaders accountable if you're not understanding the cycle that your institution is in. But more importantly, don't think that your micro level biases don't have an impact on maintaining the biases that exist. For example, I was working as a consultant, I was working with an institution that was trying to uncover why they were not able to recruit more, as they would say, diverse candidates. And they wanted me to take a look at the scoring structure that they utilized for hiring within their larger committees. And after conducting an analysis and talking to several committee members and conducting some interviews with different leadership within that institution, quickly became to realize that there were several areas of individual bias and institutional bias that was wrapped up in a process that was actually created to tear down bias. For example, they kept asking me, how do we recruit more diverse candidates? And I said, well, one thing that you need to do is change your communication. When we call candidates diverse, what we're saying is that they're not white, or that they're not male, or that they're not straight, right? We start setting the stage or the standard, right? For even in our language, right? Because we're, again, within this industry, within these institutions that we've developed, we already had a framework of who belonged. And so even our language tells us, well, this is who is already here. And now we're just looking for diverse candidates who are not like the standard, who are not like our foundation, who are not like our normal framework. One of the other things that we noticed after the analysis was they didn't have any clear metrics on how many candidates that they wanted to hire. They had zero metrics on where they were going to have the biggest impact. There was no roadmap, right? And that scoring model didn't reflect that roadmap. One of the other things about that scoring roadmap that they were using, just in the hiring practice, I noticed that there was a lack of attention to the scoring when it came to adjuncts. And if we think about this, currently in our country, right, according to a study that was conducted by the American College Institution, more than 50% of faculty across the United States and higher education institutions are adjuncts. And in that particular scoring model, if you were an adjunct and not a full-time faculty member, the scoring model said that your adjunct teaching was not worth as many points as if you were a full-time faculty member. On the surface, we could say, well, that makes sense. There's a huge difference between being an adjunct faculty member and being a full-time faculty member when it comes to commitment, professional development. But one of the key pieces that was missing at that table was that the majority, 45% of adjuncts are white. The remaining percentage of our adjuncts comprised of Black, Indigenous, Latino, and colleagues. And so here you're trying to have more diversity on your team and your colleagues in your classrooms, providing services to your students. But in a specific industry where we have created a space where more than half of our faculty our adjuncts, we don't even value the adjuncts in the same way. And if we layer on the top that race and gender is a huge part of that, we've just put ourselves out. So the biases that we have even about positions and who has those positions often go uncovered. When we start thinking about that from that perspective, we can start seeing that there are layers to this onion that need to be peeled back. And not having clear metrics is a way that we utilize to talk about our efforts in a way that says we're doing these particular activities and we have this particular initiative for, we're offering this grant, but we lack the ability to hold ourselves accountable to saying what does success look like. If we were to take our DEIB strategies and look at them the same way that we look at a student's assignment, would we give ourselves an A? Would we give ourselves a C? Are we just trying to say that it's pass fail? We just met the metric at just the smallest moment, right? And the second part about this cycle is that we use the lack of metrics to prove why we don't need to focus on this work. We will say things like, well, we put in place this initiative, it did not yield any results, right? It didn't get us where we wanted to go. And so it's useless when it comes to DEIB strategies. However, that's not always the case. Sometimes our strategies don't really align with what's happening. So now we're going to focus on disrupting and what do we need to do to disrupt our biases so that we develop better metrics. I want to give you a few statistics here, okay? And these are all from the American Council of Education from a 2017 study, as well as from the Center for American Progress from a study in 2018. 45% of college presidents lead institutions that have initiatives to attract both female and racial minority faculty. On the flip side of this was an insight that was really hard-hitting for me. This country would have 30,000 more Black and Hispanic bachelor's degree recipients who would likely major in education than we have white students, 30,000. And one of the things that was even more impactful about this insight is that when the study happened and they interviewed these students who were either in the field or majoring in the field of education within our higher education institutions, that one of the number one things that they said was that there lacked representation of how I would look as an educator. There was a lack of representation of how I could look as an administrator in education. Given the fact that this country has a huge shortage of teachers, not just in higher education, but also in K through 12 and private charter institutions across this country, our work as educators in higher education, which is literally the gateway to becoming an educator in this country, we've missed the mark and would have 30,000 more Black and brown teachers if how we restructured our own institution and what we thought about. That's that impact that we could have. Last insight I want to share is that 89% of college presidents think it is important or very important for presidents to ensure periodic review of institutional policies to eliminate gender bias. However, what good is a review if we don't set clear metrics on how to hold ourselves accountable and successful? So let's talk about this. From an internal perspective, we need to develop a clear plan to address inequities within the workforce in higher education. As I alluded to earlier, most of our programmatic thrust is focused on our students finding belonging, and that should never change. But at what point do we realize that we are doing a detriment to our own institution and our industry as a whole when we don't consider the workplace, right? Externally, we need to have clear plans and initiatives are needed to continue to support and push equity and inclusion to impact that community that we say that we're serving, right? So when we're talking about metrics here, I'm not just talking about our student metrics, I'm talking about our colleagues. So how do you start beginning to do this? If we think about this, first off, we need to identify the core, or another way to think about this, identify root causes. Does your institution or organization even know the why for why you are where you are at the moment? Or do we utilize generic bias-informed cores for the current outcome? I've often seen, for example, when I was working on my master's degree in higher education, I did a project where I was looking at the intersection of Black women learners in higher education. And I found hundreds of programs across the country that were dedicated to supporting Black men and increasing the graduation rates for Black men in college. That is an absolute core activity and core focus that we should have. But when I tried to find those same activities for Black women learners, they did not exist. It was very, very few programs nationally. When I started doing the analysis, one of the things that I learned was that institutions felt that Black women were already graduating at a higher or exponentially higher rate than Black men. And that meant that there didn't need to be a focus, and that Black women learners could either be a part of groups focused on Black students in general, or they could be focused on women. And I said, well, there's a lack of that intersectionality because Black women sit in a very different opportunity, a very different space. But one of the other things about that was that often the metrics that I found dealing with recruitment for colleagues, so that internal workforce work, was in response to the programs that we created for students. In other words, there wasn't a huge push to hire Black or Brown, Indigenous, or Asian colleagues unless there were students of those same racial makeup that were struggling and not finishing in the institution. And it really got me thinking, are we being reactive and we're only trying to create a Band-Aid? And what are we saying are successful? We might be able to get our students to the finish line of graduation, but what about our colleagues? What about the work that they're having to do? What about the work that they're having to endure, or the toxic environments that we continue to build for them? We have to think about understanding your why. So how do you find out your why? First, you actually need to conduct or have a mechanism in place to collect data and to use that information to make more informed decisions, right? Again, when we're talking about understanding your why, we can come up with as many programs and grants as we want. But if those activities don't actually address the root cause, we're never going to see a metric of success. And then what happens? We say, well, that didn't work. That's not really the issue. When really, what we developed was never meant to address the real root cause. We have to start thinking about what are the root causes for what we're doing. So if I go back to that same example of the institution that I was working with, and we were looking at trying to find ways to increase their visibility for additional candidates, one of the things that came out of that is that they assumed that there were no candidates that could fit their bill because they didn't exist. And the reality was, it wasn't that they didn't exist. Just looking at how you treated your adjuncts, when we looked at that development, there were over 25 candidates out of their last 100 candidates that could have potentially been an excellent fit for the institution. But on that scoring model, because they were adjuncts, didn't fit the bill, their score wasn't high enough. And so when we think about that root cause, trying to go out and posting your jobs on, higher education job forums that have a diverse candidate pool does nothing, right? It's not going to yield any results if the real issue isn't getting them to apply. It's actually getting your faculty and the colleagues in your institution to see that they are worthy to be in your institution and they can actually have an impact. So what if we would have shifted the conversation from the metric of how many job postings will we have, or how much money will we spend to post on these forums? And if we flip that metric and said, let's focus on how many adjuncts we're hiring, or how many people of color that we're hiring from the adjunct pool, it begins to, one will solve the problem, where the other will potentially just continue to perpetuate this idea that the talent did not exist. The second thing that you need to do and have in your programs, in your plans, is to develop really core informed actions, right? These are the initiatives and the actions needed to be directly related and have the gravitas to actually impact the core and the outcome. And this also means that, trailblazing may be required. With better analytics and insight, you can develop more specific informed actions. Trailblazing may be required to do. You might have to trailblaze in some areas to develop a new best practice within your institution. But the importance is equity and inclusion. You cannot shy away from that or having a hyper focus on just one area. All areas within an organization need to be considered. We need to be looking at both the internal and external impact. Internally, how about your colleagues? How does that representation look? Compensation, how are you paying your colleagues and those in your institutions, right? How are you creating inclusive work environments and inclusive cultures, right? Are you developing key activities and metrics that are tied back to performance? I have worked at higher education, a few higher education institutions in my time, and so many of them offer robust professional development, much like a training like this. But one of the things that I often find is that there isn't any clear tie to their performance as colleagues within this space to how focused they are on DEIB strategies. It becomes more like extra credit. I don't know about you, but I would have students say at the end of the semester, Professor Walker, I don't have a grade that I like. I know that I kind of dropped off in some way, but I want extra credit. And in the beginning of my career, I would say, absolutely, you can have extra credit. But then I began to think about this. If I structure my classroom in a way that extra credit won't be necessary, but also that I let my students know that extra work, if you focus on what we're currently working on, you won't need to do extra. We often think about some of our own initiatives as this extra credit idea. And we think about some of the initiatives on our campus as a way to kind of push at the end. Oh, I need X amount of professional development credits, or, oh, I need to get my diversity event in at the end. That's because we've set up a culture that whether or not this is a focus for you, you still have the same opportunities. Why? That's continuing to perpetuate that cycle of how our individual biases impact the institution, and then our institution has it in place that it's okay. When I worked with one institution, we actually developed some metrics around accountability for faculty and staff who had a clear focus on incorporating diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in their work. And that was tied specifically to the ability to get a raise, to the ability to get a promotion, right? I see more change in those institutions than I do for those who say, this is hard work. We're offering it, and if you accept it, that's great. We have to think about our core activities and creating metrics that will actually hold people accountable. Remember, this is not about changing hearts. This is about changing behaviors. If your strategies lack connection to performance, from leadership to middle management, all the way down to your instructors, if there isn't any attachment to our individual performance and our institutional performance when it comes to DEIB metrics, that's impactful. I would love for you to take a moment to share in the chat, what are some ways in which you have focused on DEIB and found that you are putting far more work and effort than other colleagues within your own institution, and you feel stuck, right? I want to hear about some of your experiences, because I know that there are those who have done additional work. We're a committee-driven institution, and oftentimes women, racial minorities, those who are non-binary often do far more work at our institutions because they're trying to ensure a safe space for themselves as well as the students we serve. But how often does that additional work translate to anything tangible for themselves? So feel free to share your experience with the workload that this takes and how our institutions are responding to that.
All right, good one. You're having a cavity filled? Pardon me? You're having a filling, is that where you're going? Probably.
Just while people are filling in, because I think this is related, one of the things I wonder about is that not everybody on this webinar, I would imagine, has kind of an all-encompassing power to make these changes or to talk about changing your metrics, and that they in other words, we have a lot of people who may need to manage up or try to get to upper leadership. And so I'm interested in, how do you do that? How do you do that if you're in a position where you can see it and recognize it and take what you're saying here on this webinar back to your institution? How do you, for lack of a better word, sell it to the people who are possibly setting the metrics in the first place?
Sure. And actually, that's an excellent segue, Wendy, into the next tip. So the next one is, how do you actually set performance metrics? How do you set clear KPIs? And metrics are the only way to actually commit and track progress. And as I said before, if your DEIB plan is not attached to performance, the DEIB plan becomes a performance. Having a 3 or 5 year DEI strategy for your institution that doesn't have clear metrics for accountability, that you, as more importantly, been transparent about those particular performance metrics. If we think about this, we can look at this from 2 different perspectives, both the individual and institution. So to get to your point, Wendy, from an individual perspective, whether it's developing your classes, whether it's working on committees, whether or not you're in the position to actually change your institutional metric, I used to set as an educator individual metrics for myself for my classroom. So for example, I used to ensure, and I set myself that 85% of the material that I utilize outside of the required textbook for the course would be written or co-written or led or dealing with Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latinos. And the reason that I did that was because there's research that shows that white students are not impacted negatively when the representation shown within the classroom is actually that of someone that does not look like them. However, Black, Asian, Indigenous, Latino, Hispanic students had a huge increase in engagement and success when they did see representation in their class. That was a metric I set for myself. Did it mean that I had to do a little bit more work because it wasn't always readily available? Absolutely. That was a metric I held myself accountable to. Another metric that I set for myself was that I was going to ensure that all of my videos were captioned, even from the perspective of if the institution could not help me get them all captioned, that was a personal responsibility, as opposed to me saying, well, the institution may be backed up, there may be a lack of funds to get all of my videos captioned. I made those decisions. And in doing so, when I shared that information with a few of my colleagues in my department, they began to do the same thing. And then when we started seeing metrics change within our classroom, our student success, our department wanted to know, or our division wanted to know, what's happening over in this department? What's changing, right? So you can, at an individual level, set some metrics for your own performance, right? And start tracking your own performance. And that can then start bleeding into how it can impact the institution. The next thing that we need to think about is, what are we doing at an institutional level, a leadership level, to support those who are doing this work, right? Are we finding the resources, finding the funding? Also, we can't just rest that this is the responsibility of women, non-binary, LGBTQ, or racial minorities on your college campus. White men, heteronormative men, they need to be a part of this process. White women need to be a part of this process. You should be setting the same metrics, right? You should be holding yourself accountable just as much as your other colleagues. Because again, how are we going to change that structure? We often know that in our industry, most of our college presidents and leaders have been in the classroom on the front lines at some point. So we have the ability to affect and impact change as we move and progress through our career. But it also means that we need to work with our colleagues laterally. We often want to take all of our great ideas up to the top. Sometimes you need more traction, creating some metrics within your department to hold yourself accountable and working collectively together to actually successfully see how this works. The other thing that we really need to think about, right, when we're talking about this macro level, is that these root causes and goals at the individual level should be supported institutionally, right? But at the macro level, we need to find ways to ensure that our progress relies heavily on stakeholder buy-in and long-term strategic planning, which is exactly what you're asking about, Wendy, right? Like, how do we get the buy-in? I am the baby of 4, and I've often shared stories about my own family. And being the baby of 4, there were often times where I didn't need, or I could not, or did not have the time to ask for permission, right? But instead I would say, if this doesn't work out, ask for forgiveness. We have to get to this mindset that we cannot rest or wait for leadership or some other person at the top to make a decision and hold ourselves accountable. We can start disrupting at a small level. I work with another department at an institution who was concerned in their nursing department about representation of their students. And they were saying that, you know, specifically Black women that were in that particular department, they talked about the fact that they seemed more quiet, they weren't nearly as engaged in the class, but what they did notice was that they were doing far better on exams and other assessments than some of the students that were far more engaged. And they were trying to figure out what was the disconnect. And one of the things that came out of my research that I was able to share was that Black women had a different intrinsic reason to come to college. And if you understood what those reasons are, we could start to begin to shift what activities and metrics and how you were using to engage students. And one of the things that came out of it is that I looked at their textbook, and it was a huge textbook. It was like over 1,200 pages. It was a nursing book, so quite a lot of information, quite a few illustrations. 1,200 pages. After going through that book, I didn't hit a person of color until about page 800. 800. And when I asked that particular instructor, at what point was that area covered? She said it was covered right around week 12. So I said, you have students sitting in your class for 12 weeks who've never seen anyone that looks like them, and you're wondering why they're not engaged but doing well. Their ability to do well had nothing to do with their ability to learn, but their ability to feel free to engage with you, on the other hand, was different. And that particular instructor realized that, and they couldn't change the textbook, but they could change the supplemental. But they did go back later to the publisher and talk to the publisher and said, why isn't there more representation here? And the publisher said, well, we can work on developing some more images and references and examples. And that's exactly what the publisher did in order for them to continue to work with them. It's making those kind of level decisions that are going to have a disrupting effect on our industry and how we continue to perpetuate this. There aren't any specific KPIs or metrics that I can give you to say, this is going to work for you, right? I can't say that if you do X activity, you're gonna absolutely hit 80% success rate. What I'm hoping that you understand is that for every activity, for every program, for every thought that you have that you wanna progress DEIB, you need to understand why you're sitting at where you're sitting, what activities would need to exist in order to disrupt them, and what will success look like for you? What metric of success will change, right, that root cause to a different outcome? If we don't have these three key things within our DEI strategies, both at the macro and micro level, they will always fail or give us very little results, because the reality is we're not addressing the root causes. We're addressing or inputting activities that make us feel comfortable and make us feel good, but don't necessarily hold us accountable and don't push our boundaries to do more. So just as a recap, when we think about this, first, we need to understand the role of our institution to the public and the community at large, and to moving this world forward through truth, through transparency, through the metrics that we develop. And we also have to understand and accept that higher education was built on bias, and those biases still continue today, which often act as a barrier and silos us from actually making real progress. We need to explore and think critically about the impact of the decisions that you're making as an individual within your institution, and how all of us as individuals actually make up the institution. An institution doesn't exist without us. And if we're not the ones that are moving forward that change and developing metrics, whether you're a chair and you want to develop new metrics for your faculty and staff, or whether or not you are a dean and you want to do it for your division, or whether you're a director of a student service focused area, or whether you're sitting on our president's team, you have to think about what you're doing individually. And then as individuals come together collectively, you can create metrics for success. The other part of this is that we also have to be willing to take the same advice that we tell our students. It's not always about your grade, it's about your progress. It's not always about whether or not something was perfect, but are you doing the work to get it done? We tend to hold them to a different standard than we hold ourselves when it comes to what's successful in our own rubrics and our own metrics and our own grading of our own work. And last but not least, in order to do all of this, you have to be willing to make the changes that will disrupt what's happening. You may find that you've created a metric and the activity doesn't work. Does it mean that you failed? The activity may not have worked, but what you've done for yourself is set up this new idea that you need these metrics and that you need to hold yourself accountable. and that they should be realistic, but they should also be progressive. We have to continue to push the needle forward. So as you begin to think about your DEI strategies, if you don't have clear year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 outcomes of what these group of activities are going to do, your DEI plan is still a performance because it's not sharing with your colleagues and the community at large what the expectations are. And last but not least, all of this should be related to performance. How do you tie in the overarching DEIB institutional strategy to how well, whether that's bonuses, whether that's raises, whether that's promotions? Because the reality is we do it for our other metrics. We do it for college readiness. We do it for graduation rates. We do it for matriculation rates. How come we don't do it for rates related to DEIB? We have to change the way that we think about this work and how we're going to disrupt this work going forward. So now what I'm going to do is open it up for any questions.
Definitely go ahead and type them in. I do want to just follow up a little bit on some of the comments about your last question that you posed, because it's an interesting theme. Wayne Kalinsky wrote that they developed model courses for high enrollment courses that consciously stressed inclusivity and equality or equity, and then watched several colleagues just stick with their previous way of doing things. Serving, this is Deanne Thorne, with whom I work, serving on multiple committees designed to address DEIB issues with little results, so tired of being asked to serve on committees. I think that's definitely a big challenge. And Colin Sullivan wrote, we are currently designing an equity and inclusion course for faculty so they are better equipped to teach their course with DEI in mind. The work of putting together this course is definitely not without its challenges, and we are looking at how to actually recruit faculty to participate in the course. So whereas I mentioned managing up a little bit those expectations, now it's like, okay, so we built it, will they come? So I think those are all good. Well, not good. They're all challenges that
they're all challenges. And to your point, Wendy, and I think it was Collins about, when you said, how do we recruit faculty to participate? And you said, if we build it, will they come? One of the questions that you should ask yourself is, who did you build it for? And do you even have faculty or colleagues that fit that mold? That starts to change how we think about recruiting for our institutions. We often want to develop new and innovative programs, but the people who have been perpetuating the issues are still in those same positions. And so you won't get forward movement. Sometimes the reality is you have to change people to change people. And you could do that 2 ways. My grandmother used to tell me, you either change people or you change people. You either change them through creating metrics that will hold them accountable, because again, you're not trying to change their heart, you're trying to change their behavior and how they're thinking and approaching this work. And if you do not find faculty and colleagues and leadership who want to hold themselves accountable to the place that you want to move your institution to, then it may be time to change people. Now, that's not to say that we should be firing our colleagues and getting rid of people, but the better question is, who do we value to move us forward in the next generation, right? Who's going to lead these efforts? Or are we going to still have the same style people, the same thinking in the hot seat, in the leadership roles in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? If so, we're never going to move the needle here when it comes to our industry.
True. And are there any other questions? Oh, this is from Beth Dohert Cohen. I so appreciated this. Thank you. We are in the middle of a DEI plan cycle, and COVID really knocked us off our momentum in some ways. I didn't even think about the COVID impact, and wondered about your thoughts about how quickly the context has changed in the last year and how you allow your metrics grow/change with the growth of the organization. The last year pushed our organization in great ways, and our plan feels less advanced now.
So that's an excellent question, Beth. So a few things here. When we're thinking about developing DEI plans and our cycles, we also need to ensure that we're being innovative and thinking about where our country, where our world, where our industry is headed in the 3, 5, 10 years. Often DEI strategies are in direct relation to a reaction rather than forward thinking. One of the things that we have to consider, for example, I saw lots of plans devoted to anti-racism last year because of what happened with George Floyd, but then some of those plans really only focused on anti-racism for 1 year, and then it kind of fell off. The reality is racism isn't going to go anywhere. And unfortunately, there's going to be another Black body that's recorded on video. Unfortunately, there's going to be another trans person that is assaulted. Unfortunately, there's going to be more racism, more misogyny, more patriarchy. The actions have never changed over the last 400 years. And so we need to think about, what does this look like in 5, 10 years? And what will we need to be doing to disrupt it 5 years from now, not just today? Because the reality is most of the plans that we put in place today, we won't see an impact until a few years out. And in higher education, let's be honest, we tend to have to plan out further for budgeting, and we can't always be as agile as corporations or small businesses. However, we are supposed to be scholars and innovators, and we often just focus on what's happening in front of us rather than thinking about the broader picture. So what I would definitely recommend, Beth, is look at trends that are happening in K through 12. Look at trends that are happening in the workplace, right, as you're preparing your students, but also think about what has been some overall trends within various areas within DEIB that we're seeing, and start developing, how do I address these when they get to our institution? How do I forward think about what needs to happen, but also making sure that your plan has the flexibility to move the needle if something happens that you were not anticipating. And that's another key piece to this.
Good. We have one more question. We have one comment from Deion Thorne. DEI measures should be incorporated into everything we do, which is a great comment. And then if we make this the last question, because we're wrapping up here, from Sandra Lee, if there is an opportunity for someone of a fresh start with DEIB efforts, what would you suggest to set that initial tone?
I think that if you're going to be doing like a refresh or restart, I think, especially in a higher education institution, the first thing that you need to do is ensure that all stakeholders are represented when you're thinking about this restart. There needs to be a student advisor or students that are providing some insight. There needs to be president level leadership that's providing some insight. There needs to be faculty, there needs to be adjuncts, there needs to be publishers that you're working with. There needs to be folks that are not in traditional programs. You know, if you're at a community college, what's happening in culinary, what's happening in trade. You need to get, and I know we hate more committees, but part of it is ensuring that the right people are at the table this time around. Think about who is left out of those table discussions and the opportunity to make decisions before, and ensure that there's representation there. The next thing that you need to do when you develop this committee is to create really clear metrics and expectations of what you want to do moving forward. Once you've developed this, the next key here is launching it in a way that every one of these stakeholders understands the impact that it will have on them. So when it comes to the internal piece, the workforce side, what does this mean for faculty? What does this mean for staff? Making sure that it's attached to their performance, making sure that leadership performance has to do with institutional level performance as well. And then when we're talking about our students, one thing I will definitely say as we come to a close is that we often think about serving our students, and that's a focus, but how focused are we in a restart or refresh is a great opportunity to also teach students how they should be treating each other, but also how they're treating faculty and staff. Because the reality is that racism, misogyny, patriarchy doesn't just exist in our faculty and staff, they exist in our students. And so it has to be a cycle in which we include everyone and understand what those impacts are. And that will give you the fresh start that you actually need to build on.
Thank you so much. We have come to the end of our time. Thank you all for coming. And I really want to give my thanks to Crystal Lynese-Walker for doing an excellent job once again for our Maryland Online series. Thank you, everyone.